it changed the conversation, both in potentially good ways if you believe more people need to talk about what's going on in that context, which I do, but also in ways that were challenging for us. I got a letter from 18 members of Congress asking for my resignation, and then that letter went to the board asking for me to be terminated as a consequence of it. And that didn't happen to Human Rights Watch or to others. And I think it is in part because, and the government of Israel, its Minister of Defense, as soon as we released the report, put out actually Minister of Foreign Affairs, sorry, put out a video challenging Amnesty, not challenging the others, for our findings, and basically, and then this report was followed, by the way, by the UN, stating that they agreed with us on the legal analysis through its special rapporteur, and others have since engaged in that conversation. But what I came away from that was the difficulty of putting these issues on the table and the different way in which amnesty is talked about when we do. So that's the second one. And the last one, and I'm giving you provocative ones because I'm wondering if these are on your minds and we want to talk about. The last one is our advocacy and work on Ukraine. And many of you would have heard of what's been going on here, and I want to put it on the table so that we can have a conversation about it. We did, over the first 6 months, from February, I think it was the 4th or the 24th?
24th.
The date that the war started.
24th.
24th, was it? When the war started. We've done 20 reports documenting Russian human rights violations, with people on the ground looking at both physical evidence, testimonies, but also doing digital analysis to make sure that when people put videos up of attacks on civilian installations, we were able to verify we've got an amazing digital lab, that these were actual events that had been verified and therefore could be reported out. And we did a lot of that work. And then on August the 4th, our Secretariat put out a report in the form of an extended press release that found that the Ukrainian military were also jeopardizing civilians by how they were defending cities that the Russians were attacking. And essentially it was things like they were using operational hospitals as sites to defend themselves when the Russians were attacking. And in our researchers' views, that jeopardized civilians by using occupied hospitals, and therefore needed to be documented as a human rights concern. When we put that out in an extended press release, all hell broke loose. The US government got angry with us. The fact that we hadn't properly consulted, and this is another interesting dimension, I'm being quite honest amongst folks who love amnesty here, the fact that we hadn't consulted enough with our Amnesty Ukraine colleagues in publishing the report meant that my peer, Oksana, the head of Amnesty Ukraine, felt her life was now in jeopardy, because here you had her organization saying that the Ukrainian military were committing human rights violations by how they were defending themselves. Her life was threatened. She resigned. And then, unfortunately, we institutionally responded with some social media that said, we reject the accusations that we are biased, those are just mobs and trolls. We should never have done that. It was a bit of a mistake, but we then saw Ukrainian civil society organize themselves into a fairly large campaign, more than 5,000 groups, supported by international groups, saying Amnesty needs to apologize for having documented in the way that it does. We are now in the midst of taking a review of that. I will tell you, in my view, just to put it on the table and start the conversation, I think it is our responsibility to document human rights violations on all sides in any conflict, even when one is responsible for starting the war and the other is defending itself. That's not the point of a human rights organization. We're not there to pass political judgments. We're there to make sure that the rights of civilians are protected by everyone in that moment. Now, there can be no doubt when we do that, that we should be clear on the context of the war, that we believe there was culpability for who started the war, that we believe that the extent of human rights violations are not equitable or balanced, but we should never be silenced from documenting human rights violations wherever they occur. And this may become something that will stand to us if, as is currently happening, you are seeing the Ukrainian military take more and more territory and now be asked questions, how are you treating Russian soldiers? How are you engaging to ensure human rights are protected in the territories that you're taking back? So, I've given you 3 human rights things just to start a conversation. I'm happy to talk about anything, but I'm happy to talk about protecting individuals when sometimes those individuals are challenged. Happy to talk about Israel, happy to talk about Ukraine. Also happy to talk about some of the challenges and growth needs that we're trying to take on as we are both an organization that remembers our history and what makes us special and powerful and tries to transform to be more relevant, particularly in this country where we need new approaches, new vocabularies, and new allies and new partners if we're going to stay on the forefront of human rights. So, let's have a conversation. Who wants to start?
Okay. So,
Can I meet your name again?
Justin.
Justin, that's right.
So you touched on this already a little, but whenever valid criticisms of the Israeli government are made, there's always accusations of anti-Semitism. How do you respond to those critics that, like, these aren't anti-Semitic criticisms, this is a real apartheid that people are reluctant to call that phrase?
Yeah, it's a great question. So first, as sort of a more philosophical observation, then I'll give you a specific one. I believe in human rights work, there's always 2 things that are going on when somebody is talking and when someone is listening. First, what did you say? And secondly, what did you choose to say? Meaning, one is about the validity of what you're saying, whether is it truthful, is it accurate? And secondly, there are many things that could be truthful and accurate, but you choose to say certain things. Both of those things are now being looked at, particularly in our world, our more postmodern world, where everybody asks, well, who's, not just what's being said, but who's saying it, what's their position of potentially privilege or oppression, but also what's their agenda, and everything is going to get looked at in that way. So if you're not honest about it, you will find yourself very quickly in a difficult situation. That having been said, I first forthrightly will say, I do not believe that challenging Israel to adhere to its international human rights obligations is anti-Semitic. I do not believe it, and I have said that repeatedly and constantly. That having been said, I believe anti-Semitism is a powerful force for evil in our world. I believe that it is factually the case that no community in this country, and this is an interesting one considering how much oppression Muslim populations face in this country, but no community is more attacked for the actual practice of its faith than the Jewish community in this country. That's just an empirical fact. So anti-Semitism as a scourge on human rights is a long way from being resolved, but that cannot stop a conversation about equal rights for Palestinians and Jews in Israel. And what you're seeing in the Jewish community is that is, and this is a comment that got me into trouble before. In fact, I'm going to be a little careful about this because it is not my place to presume what the Jewish community is going to say or do. That is ultimately its prerogative. But I believe that over time you're going to see a different kind of conversation in the Jewish community, that to challenge Israel and its human rights practices is not necessarily to challenge the right of the state of Israel to exist, to be anti-Semitic, or to be anti-human rights. I think you will see that evolve as a conversation, but that is ultimately a conversation in the way I've just spoken, the Jewish community has to take forward.
Just thinking about this, is it a human rights violation to take people who've maybe come into the country, America, illegally, and send them to different states without their permission? Are we engaged in is that
Yes.
a human rights violation in one way?
Yep. Yep.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Instrumentalizing human beings, putting them in arbitrary forms of captivity and using them as political symbols that denies them dignity, that denies them freedom, violates every core principle of what it means to do human rights work. It's so creatively sinister in what it's done that it may be ahead of human rights law. The thought that somebody would grab a bunch of people in another state move them to another location simply to create a symbol of I don't know, whatever they were trying to do, fear or whatever it was. If we're talking about the Martha Vineyard, for example, that moment is so sinister that it should be the subject of human rights scrutiny from a basic. I mean, at the core, I've done a lot of training on human rights in my life, to a lot of communities that didn't have the same kind of background and training that many of us have had, meaning, which, for want of a better term, Western training or American training. I did a lot of training in Afghanistan during the first Taliban, and nobody was talking about human rights in Afghanistan during the first Taliban. But when you walk into a room with women and men and ask the question, who do you believe has a right to be treated with dignity, such as they are respected as equals? Nobody sits there and goes like, well, we haven't been trained on this, we don't know. We were within 10 minutes having a fluent conversation about what the conditions for dignity were and what it means to be treated with respect by government institutions. This is very brave, because colleagues are doing this. I went there on behalf of the Afghan Women's Network. These are Afghan women during the Taliban era talking about the feeling that their human rights had been denied because of how the Taliban authorities were treating them. The reason I pull that in from your question is the fundamental wrong of what has happened with the forced moving of people to achieve a symbolic goal violates all of our common sense of what it means to treat another person with dignity and respect and as a subject of human rights in their own right. I hope that wasn't too convoluted an answer.
So, as individuals, what can we do ourselves? Like, if we see an issue, like with the world, like again, like we're part of Amnesty, but as individuals, what can we do to generate ideas for change? Because, like, for example, I'm from Kiev, and so I see a lot of issues like, oh, I really want to help, but either I don't know how, or like I do help, but I feel like it's not enough.
So I do know a little, Jared, that you found Amnesty by showing up.
Yes. That's a big step forward.
Yes, you showed up, you said, how can I help? Emily said, well, why don't you think about coming and sitting in a room with others? And the fact that you have your experience, look, there's a lot going on in our world which is challenging the notion of global human rights activism. One thing that's going on, just to put it out there on the table, is a real concern about white saviorism, which is basically people who haven't experienced suffering but wanting to do something useful, acting in such a way that does not examine their own privilege and believes that they have sort of, for want of a better term, a right to go and save other folks. Now, a lot of that white saviorism stuff is about how they show up, because if they do it humbly, and they say, look, I don't have a right to help other folks, I just believe in human connectivity, and I know I can be useful, I just like to work out how I can be useful. If it's done with that's what white saviorism is a critique of. It's not the idea that we shouldn't reach across borders and be useful to each other. It's believing that we have some kind of right to help the less fortunate because we're in a position of privilege for whatever reason, our money, our race, our class. We have privilege that entitles us to save others. So it's really about how we show up. So with the opposite of that, the idea of unexamined privilege is authenticity, is a sense of inclusion through belonging, through actually feeling like I have an authentic reason to be here. If you're starting a conversation that says, look, I have my family connections are to Kiev, and I would like to be useful in this moment as part of an international human rights group. In this day and age, that lands really powerfully because people trust and know that you're bringing an authentic experience of what is actually going on because you're feeling it yourself, and that matters. So, I mean, well, I would just say, I don't mean to push it back on you, but with that comes responsibility. You have to choose whether you're going to engage with others to advance what you can do or not. And I'm just really glad that you're in this room and that you went up to Emily and that you're organizing. The more specific answers are organize, work with others, get resources, try new things, because there is no magic solution.
Thank you.
Should we do a couple of back? Sorry, go on.
There's one over here who
You-
just had his hand up.
Please.
I'm sure you've heard about what happened this morning in Thailand.
I didn't.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I have been in literally since 8 o'clock this morning. So tell me what happened.
So there was 36 kids, if I'm sure, they were massacred in a shooting. And I know it's a really hard topic to approach
Oh my God.
because I have two brothers that go to high school, you know, and I wanted to ask, how would you, or how would Amnesty International suppress or kind of like approach the crimes against children that's happening right now and will continue to happen if we don't approach this issue as soon as possible?
So first, thank you for bringing it in the room. That's hard. So I don't know if everybody heard, and I hadn't heard this because I have literally been in back-to-back, including on the drive here. 36 young people
Children.
Children.
Children, yep.
Daycare.
in a daycare
Yeah.
in Thailand. Okay. So, I'm just sorry to hear that. So what Amnesty does in moments like that, and unfortunately one of the challenges we're facing is in certain contexts, India, China, Thailand, and others, the ability of our eyes and ears on the ground, now increasingly in Sri Lanka, to be the first port of call there, which it normally is. We do have very good staff in Thailand. In fact, the first person I would reach out to is somebody called PK, who is our authority. I just connected them to the State Department to talk about what's going on in Thailand yesterday. We would ask the parts of our movement that are closest to the ground, how can we help you in those contexts? How can we organize? Something like this, my expectation is there would be an urgent action very quickly, where we would be seeking help from members, student groups, local groups to amplify concerns. The key thing is to get the right asks on both the accountability side, who was responsible, how do we find out, but also on the support side in terms of how do we get protection to others who may now feel vulnerable or who are the relatives of those folks as quickly as possible. So, and then from there, depending on, and I just don't know the facts of this case beyond what you've told me, there could be a more structured response, but that would come out of our regional office. I just spoke to them 2 days ago, currently in Sri Lanka, as to how we organize the movement to be supportive, to ensure that there is government action by each of our governments. So we would be going to the US government and saying you need to take action to hold the government, if it's the government of Thailand. Either, it's respect, protect, fulfill are the three sort of core human rights responsibilities. Respect means they cannot be the ones who targeted the children and they must be held to account. Even if it wasn't them, if it was, say, do you know who the actors were who did it?
An ex-policeman.
Ex-policeman, okay. So they may argue that he is no longer a government official. It doesn't matter. They have a protect function to ensure that children are protected in their society. So, but it's just how we lay out the arguments.
He killed his family and himself
And then he did that.
afterwards.
Oh my God. And we've obviously been experiencing that in this country
Gun
too.
violence.
Yeah, no, sorry.
Knife. It was a knife.
A knife?
Knife.
Gun and knife.
And there was a
Nurse.
well, and there was another recent mayhem through knife attacks in an indigenous population 2 weeks ago. Please.
When you look at different countries and you see an atrocity like that, or when you look even at America and you see atrocities occur like that, is it ever an issue to sort of find a way to sort of mention that sometimes also mental health may be an issue, a mental health issues that exist in those specific countries as well?
Yeah.
Is that also a challenge? Because sometimes I feel like when you look at situations like that, though yes, what the person did was bad, you also do take a view at the country as well to see how the mental health in that scenario
Yeah.
is affected.
You know, I'm sure Lauren has, on the basic courses of human rights, we learn about the conventions and how the movement came to be what it is today. And I don't know how you all covered it, but one of the experiences for me was the insanity of this division between the civil and political rights which allow us to achieve our goals, hopefully through peaceful political processes and organizing on the one hand, and the economic, social, and cultural rights which allow us to live lives of dignity on the other. The idea that they live in separate spheres, and it is a challenge for the United States because the United States bringing to bear its political philosophy for the world, which is sort out the politics, everything else will follow, was essentially what the argument was, still is one of very few countries to have signed the International Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. It's one of only 2 countries that has not signed the Convention on the Rights of the Child because it has economic rights provisions in there like healthcare, like the right to education and so on. It makes no sense. Your question is entirely right. If you think of what are the causes of of human rights violations, they're almost always a blend of economic oppression, discriminatory oppression, and civil and political oppression coming together, including healthcare. So, I can't, yeah.
I just, this is sort of, I have so many questions, but I'll start with, when you hear stuff like this, I mean, like, I've been in this for 2 years and I already feel at times that I just want to give up because I'm so frustrated.
Yeah.
So how do you keep going? Like, how do you hear from these terrible, for the nature of our work, and continue to basically fail constantly and to just accept that and keep going? Like, how do you find it in yourself to do it?
Yeah. So, I love the question. I think it's a really serious one. I think our movement does lose folks, including, you know, we were talking earlier on, student groups have formed. We have 600 student groups around the country. They form, but they don't always stay as involved. And some of it, I think, is because it's so intense to be covering these cases, to be hearing this, to feel like, wow, there's a lot of toughness. And then, you know, life gets in, and I honestly, I don't think Amnesty does enough to create what comes next. But your question sort of, is it because the work is so hard? How do you continue to stay energized and inspired? I will say, so here's one answer for you. And it allows me to go back to talking about my favorite pilot, which I talked to you about at the beginning. So, the book that I wrote before I joined Amnesty, and I think it sort of helped me to get the job because the 10 people who read the book were the 10 people who interviewed me. I wish I was kidding, but I'm from the sales numbers. Anyway, they read the book, and we talked about it during the interview process. But one of the things I was talking about is that it's sometimes useful to understand power in 2 types of ways. One form of power is it's a finite form of power. It's zero sum. If one person has it, another person doesn't, and it's usually to do with the control of a resource, like money, or the control of a particular decision. One person gets to make it, and often in human rights work, the hardest part of human rights work is when the wrong kind of actor has a form of zero-sum power over another, meaning a autocratic dictator or a corporate titan is able to shut down the rights or even the life of another individual through their actions. They control that space. And that is a very sinister form of zero-sum power. I get to make this decision, and I'm going to do that to you. There is another form of power, which is power as energy, power as activism, power in terms of how you build political force to change outcomes. And it's not zero-sum. You can get more and more people behind a human rights agenda, and you can make it more and more difficult for those who want to exercise sinister forms of zero-sum power to do that. My belief in human rights activism is you have to create space in your own lives to build energy, to feel energized, to build power, to have more people alongside you in sisterhood and brotherhood and in the fight against the bad guys. And you can build that power through effective human rights activism. That's why this local group has been going for so long, because it feels an energy when they're together. And it will only sustain as long as they feel that time and energy is useful and is leading to something else. I say that to you because this pilot, people said to me, okay, what's going to be success for this individuals at risk pilot you're launching? And is it going to be the number of individuals at risk we can get out of trouble? And I said, of course, and I don't get to decide this, but I'm the executive director, so I get to start a conversation. I said, of course, in the end of the day, everything we do is measured in terms of human rights impact. That's what matters most. Are we making a meaningful difference? But right now, there are so many sinister forces targeting the frontline human rights defenders in the United States and around the world that we have to build our political power. We have to build our energy. So the metrics of success for this pilot in year 1 are not going to be how many individuals at risk did we make a difference for. That will be measured, but it's not going to be the only measure. The 3 measures that I'm going to be asking most about is, did we get more members to fight these fights? Did we get more people to join? Could you find 5 people to work with us in the way you have been? Are we increasing the diversity of our membership? Are we changing who wants to be part of the Amnesty community? Because we haven't been diverse in our history, and we need to if we're going to stay relevant. Because a lot of the toughest fights are being fought by communities of color, by LGBTQ communities, by all sorts of actors on the front lines of human rights in this country and around the world. If we're not relevant to them, we may not be relevant. We've got to diversify. That's the second metric. And the third metric is, are we deepening people's sense of activism? Because right now people are feeling like, wow, everything I'm doing, these bad guys seem to have an answer for. Are we finding new ways to feel powerful, to feel energy? If we could have a year in which we're exponentially growing our numbers, exponentially diversifying our membership, and deepening our activism, where some student groups and local groups are coming up with great ideas and we're amplifying them and supporting them, I believe we will have that human rights impact, the more zero-sum kind of impact we want to have, which is we want to take away the power of unaccountable autocrats to be able to do what they want. So that's the longest-winded answer to a simple question. But what I'm saying is, when you feel disheartened by how hard human rights work is, remember that you always have a choice. Fight the tough fight of the person who has too much power right in front of you, or work with others to build your power, because you'll get to fight another day.
We have time for one more question.
Okay.
My name is Noel Scott. I just kind of want to pry your brain here. This is something that we're discussing in my global studies class. So when we talk about reparations specifically for the Black community, people think it's typically financial, that it'll come from taxpayer money, and it'll be hard to allocate these rewards. I think it's something that should be addressed. I think we just kind of have this conversation all the time, and no one really is tapping into it and really going in depth. So should it start with the descendants of slaves, or should it be from extended to people that who survived through the Jim Crow era? So like, where should we start with this issue?
Wow, okay. Love the question, love the question. Start with the issue. I think it is one of the most interesting human rights conversations that's going on right now, the issue of reparations, particularly in this country, but not exclusively in this country. Also in the Caribbean, it's fascinating and important what is going on. What it is allowing us to do is to have a conversation that is accepting that we are not starting from zero in our conversation. It's like we're not starting in a race-blind world where there's no history, where there's no backdrop. We're starting from histories of privilege and oppression, and we need to both talk about that differently, understand it differently, and then act on it differently. I honestly would not say I have a good answer for your very specific question, who needs to lead it. I do think there's this real dilemma, and I say this as an older white male who has had a lot of privilege in my own life. I want to be a good ally, but in supporting the leadership of others on issues of anti-racism. But I have a lot of inner work to do myself to understand how to show up usefully. I obviously have no problem having some level of authority and power in this world, because I applied for this job and I got it, and I'm not ashamed of that. But on questions of how I show up as an anti-racist in this moment in this country, I have a lot to learn, and I'm lucky to be at Amnesty, where I'm given some space, not infinite space, but some space in which to learn. how to be a good ally. Thank you for the question.